evening to everyone, and welcome to this Light of KAILASH lecture, which is a series of talks that the Jansen Institute UK is running, and I'm pleased to introduce our speaker for this evening, Professor Berthe Jansen. Berthe is Assistant Professor of Tibetan Studies at Leiden University in the Netherlands, where she was awarded her PhD doctorate in Buddhist Studies, and prior to which she obtained an MPhil in Tibetan and Himalayan Studies at Oxford University. And Berthe's research has focused on social and religious history, including topics such as the Buddhist influence on Tibet's legal system, as well as on tax and marriage conventions as well, and the influence of Buddhism there. But for tonight's lecture, Berthe will share the outline of a 5-year ERC starting grant project, which looks at the collection of a scholar named Johan Van Manen and explores issues pertaining to researching and storing of ritual texts and artifacts. So please note that there will be time for questions at the end of Berthe's talk. You're welcome to pop those questions in the chat as we go along, or otherwise just keep them in mind, and we can come back to them at the end of the talk. So again, thank you everyone for being here, and Berthe, welcome to you. I'll hand over now for the talk.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you for those who have tuned in. So today I'm going to give an overview of my research project. This is a project that is funded for 5 years. We're now a bit less than 1.5 years in, and I'm going to, show some of my findings, and but also generally what we're going to do, and I hope it will be of interest to you. So we'll have to see how we go here. So basically, this research project is about a collection, not just any collection. It's materials that were collected by Johan Van Manen, who passed away in 1943. And he collected not just Tibetan manuscripts and block prints, but he also collected material objects, ritual objects, Himalayan art, objects of use. And in addition to that, and what is really special, one of the very special things about this collection, is that he had his assistants, and you can see 2 of them depicted on the slide here, standing behind Van Manen. He had them write their life stories down, and we're talking about the 1920s. And these people wrote their life stories down in Tibetan, but not just any Tibetan. They wrote it down in colloquial Tibetan because they were not trained in sort of Tibetan literary arts. So that means that these life stories are not just really special because we get a perspective of non-elite Tibetan and Himalayan agents, but you also have kind of a recording of the way people spoke in those days, making it quite extraordinary. Another part of this collection are these unarchived written materials. That's point 3 on the slide, and what I call the ephemera, the things that may or may not belong or give us clues as to where these texts are from, where these objects are from, or may just be random chits and notes and pieces of paper. And this is kind of what we are tasked with putting together. Now, Johan Van Manen was initially a Dutch theosophist. He is described as a self-made man. He never finished secondary school. He did not go to university. He had an early interest in sort of the East mysticism, esotericism, and he ended up, as one did in those days, at the Theosophical Society, and he became quite sort of prominent early on in the Netherlands, and then in 1909 he decided to take a job as an assistant librarian of the Library of the Theosophical Society in India, in Adyar, which is close to current day Chennai. He left the Theosophical Society. He became disenchanted with the Theosophical Society during the First World War, and that mainly had to do with the sort of the political stance that the Theosophical Society took, and Van Manen didn't agree with that sort of political liaison, and he decided to move to this area that you see highlighted. I don't know if the cursor actually works on here. He moved to Darjeeling in order to properly study Tibetan, and that's, for us at least, where the interesting part of his life begins, because this is when, and this is, so we're talking about 1918, 1718, this is when he starts properly collecting Tibetan texts. This is when he meets with his interlocutors, with his assistants, and this is when he starts publishing also on Tibetan culture, literature, religion, and even art. So when he died, all his material, and saying all that's not true, most of his material was actually acquired, was bought by the Ethnographic Museum, Leiden University, and what we now have ended up with are, you'll see here in the slide, almost 1,000 block prints, 576 manuscripts, language manuscripts, and then cataloged artifacts. Then there are some uncatalogued ones as well. These boxes of ephemera that I spoke of, and then also Lepcha manuscripts. So for those of you who don't know, Lepcha is another Tibeto-Burman language, which is not very close to Tibetan, but spoken by the original inhabitants of exactly this region, the Lepcha or Rung people. And what we then ended up with is actually the largest Lepcha literary collection, current day literary collection in the world. Never published on this. So what we want to do as a project, or what are sort of some of the questions, we have things, we have text, we have bits of paper. So how does it make sense? And one of the complicating matters as well is the fact that the objects are in the Ethnographic Museum, which is now renamed the World Museum in Leiden, and the textual materials are at the special collections in the Leiden University Library. So how do these, if at all, how do they fit together? How can we make sense of how text and object work together? And then also, can you then understand these works as kind of a reflection of the cultural production that was going on in this region at the time? And so can we then get a kind of a picture of what kind of text, what kind of art, what kind of objects were available at the time in that region? So these are some of the questions, that bigger questions that we're asking. But in order to answer these bigger questions, you also have to zoom in on to what we actually have at hand. Fortunately, I'm not alone. These are the other core members of the project. From my left to right, Samten, who is my PhD student, who works on the ritual texts, mainly to do with different phases of death, of which we find a lot of in our collection. In the middle, we have Niels Martin, who is working on material side of things, on artworks, and then Berthe, who is working on the autobiographies. So we'll be working together, and it's really very nice to have a team where we can sort of approach this material from all these different angles, and at the same time talk with each other and learn from each other. So what we have, and this is also what I'm kind of how I structured this talk. So we have these artifacts, we have the manuscripts, we have this ephemera, and also what Van Manen wrote, what he published, but also what he did not publish. There's a bunch of things that he wrote on or he worked on, and we have his notes, but he never actually published them. And then the autobiographies, and then of course the question is how to bring these together. In the bottom of this slide, you see a little drawing. I will also speak a little bit more about this, but this is actually one of the authors of the Tibetan autobiography. He illustrated, or he illustrated his life story with little drawings, and very clearly they had intended to publish these works, and unfortunately they were never published. But this is something that we're also hoping that we are planning at least to achieve. And in this little pen drawing, you see Van Manen standing on the right and his two assistants working away on the left. He's his Sino Tibetan assistant writing in Chinese, and on the right, his Tibetan assistant writing Tibetan. So we have another thing really quite complex, as I mentioned. We have his notes on things, works in progress, and the problem, of course, is that these are largely unfiled, uncatalogued. So we have kind of a hodgepodge of different papers, and we hope to make some sense out of these. On the left, there is a study of he did on Tibetan proverbs, and on the right is actually a receipt of objects that he had asked someone to bring from Tibet. So there's actually the prices of the objects are noted right there. So also for social history, this is quite interesting kind of material. So why collect? Why did he collect? This is always kind of, for me, an interesting question. And it seems that even though Van Manen initially was a theosophist and quite interested in the esoteric things, he develops himself more and more as an academic, not really as sort of the in the strict sense, but he employs more sort of scientific methods, and he also then looks at what do we know and where are the gaps in our knowledge. And then he talks about how he is interested in the study of Tibetan gods. He writes that the topic has been little illustrated from its material aspect or from the ritual aspect. And he also notes that these aspects are close to ethnography. So this is kind of one of his early kind of research projects, and it's kind of the red thread you see in his interest is that he looks at what has not been done, but also he looks really much from the grassroots level up. He looks at he asks Tibetans, he looks at what people do, and then he starts collecting based on what he sees, what he hears, and not kind of a top down. So I would like to know about these things, and then he starts asking, kind of the other way around. So some of these artifacts are on display, but there are very few of them, and that partly has to do, of course, with the limited space and the museum that they're on display is an ethnographic museum, so they want to display the whole world. There's a little room that is devoted to South Asian objects mainly. And another reason is that from an artistic point of view, many of these objects are of low quality. That means they are objects of use. They're not pieces there that are necessarily like many pieces that you can sort of class as fine. And so you also have these objects of use, some of which, of course, are interesting for an ethnographic museum, and others are mostly there kept in storage. So, of course, we also look at how they were collected. Of course, there's this lively discussion and a very important discussion going on within the academic society, but also society at large. So, what do we do with objects that were taken from another culture, another country, most of the time under the strains and the constraints of colonialism? What do you do with these? So provenance research here is also very important, and I call them paracolonial artifacts because we, of course, have a kind of an interesting nested situation where we have a Dutch person living in British India collecting Tibetan materials. So there's no straightforwardness here whatsoever. Not straightforward to say, well, these were taken from India or by a colonizer. So these are some of the objects that are currently on display, some of the nicer ones. But then there's also quite a few that are not on display. So on the left-hand side, you see a very interesting map. It's actually a pilgrimage map to Mount KAILASH. And we have no context for this. We don't know where he got this. It looks pretty, it looks like it's from the early 20th century. And it looks like it was in use at some point. But beyond that, we have no context. On the right-hand side, another one of these things where we have a Tibetan protector god, maybe Berthe, but he is framed in an Indian-made frame, probably for a Western market. So you have kind of different contexts that we have in our collection. Then we have a number of tsatsas as well. This is just to show you what's going on. Then we have the manuscripts. One of our difficulties, of course, we have more than 1,500 manuscripts or block prints and manuscripts. And then you have to think about also what is special about these manuscripts, because of course we can find lots of them, different versions on BDRC, and what do they say as a collection about cultural production or production of literature, but also, of course, the religious landscape. If a text is easily available in a certain region, that tells you something about how important that text was in that region. So there's lots of works also to do with astrology, and I will talk about the reasons for that a little bit later, even though Van Manen never published anything on astrology. This is just some example of the Lepchet text, which for the moment they are outside of the scope of our project. There is a lot of interesting material there, so if anyone sees this and is inspired to work with these materials, especially from a kind of a cultural, historical point of view, please do not hesitate to contact me. There's also some little doodles in some of these works as well. And then we have our ritual text. This is many of these are actually most of these manuscripts and block prints were actually digitized. They're digitally available via the University Library website. You can download them, but unfortunately they were digitized in black and white, and this one is actually colored. This is a manual for making dolma, and there are a couple of these kind of very pragmatic works in here. So here you can see they are digitized, but not digitized in an ideal way. This is actually a bound manuscript, and this is sewn at the top, and the digitizer has decided not to take the pains to sort of split the pages, but just this means you have to keep on turning the scan around and around. Not ideal. Some of these potentially unique texts. And then we get to the ephemera, and that's kind of what I am tasked with, or this is kind of to some extent the most difficult part of the whole enterprise, it seems. And also, what can these ephemera tell us about provenance? So here we have that bill, this receipt that I showed you just prior, and on the right hand side, actually, there is a shopping list of the things that Van Manen had asked a Tibetan geshe. It says on the bottom right, says the geshe leaving for Lhasa. So these are the items that he asked him to bring back from Tibet, and it's also dated. So these are kind of the things that I'm dealing with, among others. And then we also have his unfinished research. So you can see that he worked on oral traditions quite a lot, which is quite extraordinary for not unique, but quite extraordinary for the time. So he asked people within this greater Darjeeling area to tell me, and in this case, he was working on a book about Yeti stories. So he was asking everyone, tell me your Yeti stories. Tell me what you know about Yetis. And these Yeti stories are collected in this book, written in Tibetan, and he actually started making translations. And it is very clear that he had planned to publish a book consisting of Tibetan Yeti stories. Unfortunately, it was not to be. But with this project, this might happen. It might actually find a way. So here are some other insights. There are some drawings. These are photocopies. There must be original drawings somewhere here, and this is kind of his research. This is the file consisting of his research and his notes. So then coming to the autobiographies, I already talked a little bit about these. They are interestingly called namtak, and if you don't know what these are basically they're often translated as hagiography, which means these are the stories of saints. So in a Tibetan context, a namtar is usually a biography of a person with some religious standing, of some spiritual significance. Ordinary people would not tend to write namtar. So it is quite interesting here that these autobiographies are on the whole called namtar. And of course, this whole notion of life stories and life writing as something that ordinary people did, so non-religious, people who did not have a religious standing or religious status, is really something that only developed a lot later, and in exile, and then even then, these are often stories that have some political significance. So they are, in many ways, these autobiographies are really quite unique, and we have 4 more or less well-known ones of people we actually know, and then there's also three autobiographies that are a little bit of people we have less information on. And what is also interesting is that these people all have different, quite often quite complex ethnicities. So we have someone from central Tibet, very complex. But we also have a Sino-Tibetan, so someone with a Chinese father and a half Tibetan mother who was raised in Lhasa. We have someone from Sikkim, someone from the Chumbi Valley, someone from the Darjeeling region itself, someone from Ladakh. So there's actually kind of all the different kind of flavors of Tibetan people writing in Tibetan, but with different ethnicities, with this different national identities and what have you, kind of are represented in these autobiographies. And some of these, three of these, have actually been published in a very heavily abbreviated version, in kind of using the draft English translations that were already made in the 1920s. And these were edited by Berthe and but they are heavily abbreviated. And this editor, even though he really tried his best, he does not read Tibetan, which of course means that you're kind of limited. So unfortunately, Gunda Tibak will be publishing full translations of these autobiographies, and we're also planning to publish them in open access format in Tibetan language, so that people all over the Tibetan reading world can read these. So here are some more illustrations by someone called Jansen, who's the Sino-Tibetan scribe, and his illustrations, while clearly not done by someone who has extensive training, they are very informative. So here, this illustration describes the ritual of taking the Tibetan kangyur, the cannon, around the fields for a good harvest. So there's kind of some of these festivals and rituals are very nicely illustrated as well. So now, going from texts, artifacts, ephemera, and autobiographies, actually to the context. So I just came back last week from a field work trip to India to actually go to the source of where Van Manen learned Tibetan, where he met with his assistant, and where he started collecting his texts. And this brings us to a place called Kum, which is actually just below Darjeeling. It's kind of now one conglomerate. And we get to this monastery, which is one of the older monasteries in Darjeeling, called Yiga Chuling. And he lived quite close to there for a number of years. And his assistants, especially the ones depicted here, were directly affiliated to this monastery. And this monastery is kind of famous, or actually it should be more famous, in that it was once the center of Tibetan studies, I would say in the world, because this was a monastery founded by a relatively famous person, called Sopo Lama, a Mongolian Lama, Sherab Gyatso. So either in 1850 or 1875, there's no consensus about that. But what is quite special is that he, according to oral tradition, what I learned from my fieldwork is that he got permission to build this monastery from the British. and he was very close to the British because he had kind of promised to teach Tibetan to certain British agents who, and some of them, of course, had a very pure motivation to learn Tibetan, to learn about Tibetan culture, but others were maybe more interested in political gains. So he is kind of known for training and setting up the school in which he trained Anglo-Himalayan people in Tibetan, but also taught certain famous people like Savachamwa Das Tibetan. So, and it's also interesting because he is well photographed. We have, this is just one picture on the left, but there's many more. And in the monastery, actually based on these photographs, we have this statue made of clay. And what I found when working with the ephemera, kind of by accident, stuck to something else, was in fact this Sopo Lama, this Mongolian Lama's autobiography. And I went to this monastery and asked the people, do you know any writing of this Lama? And they said, we have nothing. This is the problem. We have this founder and we know some things about him and he's written about in British sources, but from a Tibetan side, we have nothing. So this is one of my future projects to work with this autobiography because I found it. It's not very long, but I kind of gave it back to where it belongs, in the interior of the monastery. So then this monastery kind of becomes a center, or kind of the starting point for our collection. And I was also able to photocopy or photograph the inventory of all the manuscripts that are currently present in this monastery, and our aim is also to compare them with what we have to see the extent to which Van Manen used the library, consulted the library of this monastery. So you see the inventory in the middle. And this is a future research project, and then we will actually start opening up the texts and comparing them to what we have in Leiden. That also brings us to, I mentioned that there is an extraordinary amount of astrological works in our collection. And as luck would have it, and actually I don't think this is entirely coincidental, this Mongolian Lama, he writes in his autobiography that he trained as an astrologer. He trained as an astrologer in Beijing. And then he was also, based on the oral history that I gathered, he was also well known for being an excellent astrologer and mathematician, which in Tibetan happens to be the same word. See? We then maybe are all these astrological works are thanks to the fact that Van Manen had access to this Lama's personal library. And I have to note, of course, this Lama had already passed away when Van Manen was there, so he was no longer on the scene. And what happened to his personal library, we actually don't know, but it might well be that Van Manen had somehow access to this. What we also find is this chart. Again, this is in the museum, and there's no context for it whatsoever. But what we know is that this is an astrological chart. What I did not yet mention was that after Van Manen left Darjeeling, he got a job at the Asiatic Society in Calcutta as he became first he was a librarian, then he a secretary, and then a general secretary. And what they kind of did at the Asiatic Society was that they had something that I would call like an academic show and tell. So they had these meetings, annual meetings, but monthly meetings as well, where you had all these people, and some were ornithologists and geologists and people from all different kind of fields would come together and just show, oh, this is what I found this month, this is what I have, and kind of talk about it. So then the proceedings that were published kind of record these sessions. And actually there we find that Van Manen talks about exactly this chart. And he gives us context. He says the chart was copied by the exhibitors Tibeto-Chinese Munshi Chenchen. So this is the person I just mentioned, the one who likes to draw, from an original in the possession of a professional diviner. And the explanatory book was by a single coincidence obtained at the same time. And it's a good example of modern Tibetan colored book illustration. And it also then mentions that many that illustrations exist in block prints, but not with colors, and then that colored manuscripts have to be produced by hand. So here we already find some context, and of course then the challenge lies in the explanatory book, which is something that I am not fully positive that I found the explanatory book. Also, I am not an expert in astrology, Tibetan astrology. So, but one of these illustrated astrology books, manuscripts, is copied here again by the same scribe. And this is actually by Durya Karpo, which is the most famous Tibetan work on astrology. And it is again very nicely illustrated by Chenchen. And here you can see the author is depicted of this work, who is the Sangye Gyatso. So this might be it, but then there are some other illustrated, colorized, illustrated Tibetan works on astrology as well. So the jury is still out on that. Another way, a place in which we can kind of bring the objects and texts, kind of reconnect them, is via the autobiographies. And in the English version of the autobiography of one of the assistants, Kama Babu, or Kama Somdem Paul, we actually find this where he writes, on the 4th day of the 6th month of the Tibetan calendar, I asked my Sahib, so this is Van Manen, for permission to perform a ritual called Chu. Being a Buddhist himself, he, so that's Van Manen, even lent me a large hand drum and a thigh bone from his collection. So the thigh bone, at least one of the thigh bones, is still there, and you can see it on the picture on the slide. And it may, we have not found that yet, but the Tibetan version of these autobiographies contains much more detail. So it might be the case that actually he writes about which particular text he uses for this ritual. So I have depicted just one of them, but there are at least 8 different, not different, or versions of texts in our collection. So these are kind of ways where we can see how texts and objects and also these autobiographies intersect. So it's a work in progress. We are working on creating this database, publishing autobiographies in Tibetan, but also in translation, studying the collection as a whole, and sort of thinking about how, when we go back to that sort of place of origin, which is to some extent Darjeeling or the greater Darjeeling area, but also Tibet, because he also asked people to bring back things from Tibet. We are also thinking about the original, quote unquote, original context as well. So there's a lot to do, but overall, so we have this, well, largely unstudied collection, and we want to sort of understand the collection process. We also want to understand the provenance of these works. We want to understand the context of these works, and we have to sort of take all these different elements and try to make this fit. But hopefully, this will end up being helpful in understanding a bottom-up process of religio-cultural production. And of course, the idea is also that this is not the only collection that is a multimedia collection that has texts and ephemera and objects. And we're basically trying to create some kind of model that other people can to work and to use for their own collections. And this could be private people, but also, of course, museums and libraries and what have you. This is just a brief, and in the context of our project, we're also organizing a workshop, which is taking place 10 days. I'm really very busy right now. There's a lot to do. And where we talking exactly about how text and things and text kind of work together. So that's it from my side. Do I have more? No, that's it. And very happy to hear get any of your questions or feedback.
Brilliant.
What have you.
Well, thank you very much, Berthe. A really interesting insight into the work you've been doing around this collection. And yes, I mean, I was really struck by the fact that it's really, as you've mentioned, a kind of bottom-up type of anthropological type of inquiry, I suppose. And it's not dealing with, elites and a lot of the kind of history around Tibetan culture is often based around elites and religious figures. So in that sense, I wondered does it occupy a bit of a unique space as a collection on Tibetan culture and artifacts, or are there comparative collections that you're aware of and which you've perhaps liaised with? And my other kind of question related to that is whether during your fieldwork trip you could attempt to trace any of the descendants of the people that Van Manen was living amongst and detailing, or was that not practically possible in terms of tracing those descendants?
Yes, so these are basically two questions. So about the first question, if there's comparable collections, I think yes and no. One of the quite extraordinary kind of people to follow in Van Manen's footsteps to some extent was René Nebeski-Wojkowicz, who worked in the same area, also in Darjeeling and Kalimpong, worked with ledger material, worked with Tibetan material, and also collected artifacts and ritual texts. And I was also interested in the study of Tibetan gods, culminating in this very famous book, Tibetan Oracles and Demons, or Demons and Oracles. And this is not a coincidence, because before this book was published, René Nebeski-Wojkowicz had been asked by the director of the Ethnographic Museum in Leiden to catalog Van Manen's collection, just the textual material. So it is quite certain that he took a lot of inspiration from the kinds of texts that Van Manen had collected. And he ended up collecting many similar works as well. And there was a recent research project that had just ended, I think, this year in Vienna, where they also looked specifically at Nebesky Vojković's sort of artifacts research, kind of ephemera correspondence, but also manuscripts and texts, and kind of putting them together. The difference is, of course, to some extent, well, this collection in Vienna is a little bit smaller, or quite a bit smaller, and also the aspect, also these autobiographies, these life stories, sort of or oral traditions that Van Manen really emphasized are not there. And I think also if you try to look for other comparable collections, you will not find that. So these autobiographies is really what makes Van Manen's collection really unique. As to the second question about sort of tracing the descendant, it is, of course, 100 years after the fact. My fieldwork trip was more focused on context and getting. It's also an initial trip.
Berthe, I think for a second. Oh, I can hear you again. Sorry.
Okay.
Sorry, just cut out for a moment.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry.
Okay, so my trip was focused on establishing connections with the initial fieldwork trip. But my colleague, Berthe, who works on the autobiographies, and I actually did get some leads on there. For example, I learned of the name of the man who actually met one of the assistants in person. But I was not able to meet him because he wasn't there at the moment. But so these are definitely things that we're going to follow up on. But in this initial field work, that was I've not focused on that. But what is very nice about this project is that sort of we have the kind of funding that allows us to go regularly, and we will all go. So first of all, it's very good to establish all these contacts, and then I am sure we'll find some interesting things out about the ordinary, but also very special people.
Really interesting, and as you say, it's just fascinating that it's such a unique collection. So that really makes it quite special. And I mean, another question that comes to mind is around the study of an oral tradition like this. And you had a slide detailing, the investigation into Yetis. And I suppose my question is, whether in oral traditions, that's a way through which folklore and stories are kind of transmitted. And is it actually a vehicle through which, culture and tradition is actually embedded in those communities within the Himalayas?
I would say yes. I mean, the oral traditions are hugely important for Himalayan traditions on so many levels. But at the same time, it's also something which kind of, as a sign of the times, are also exactly the traditions, because they are intangible. They are the ones that we lose the fastest. And of course, if we look at, for example, culture in the West, at some point, oral traditions were also very important, sort of the storytelling around the fireplace, and that's been replaced by watching TV and scrolling on our phones, and that's of course a different kind of culture. But of course, this is the same thing is happening. in the Himalayas. So it is very interesting or very important also to look at these oral traditions. And here we can also compare, we have some, for example, we happen to have some wedding songs as well that were sung 100 years ago, recorded in the archives. I did not mention them, but we have wedding songs. So you could sort of see we have that record. And usually oral traditions, of course, they are unstable. You cannot it's very difficult to historically pinpoint and say, well, this is where it changed, or this is when this was sung. But here we actually have a point of departure, and then you could sort of take these wedding songs and look at what's happening now and compare them. So in that sense, to have oral traditions written down, which are then 100 years old, are really quite precious.
Indeed, indeed. Are there any questions from the floor that anyone would like to raise? I did have a small question to mention as well, which is just about the Lechen language. Is that a type of Tibetan dialect, and is it still extant, or is it a language that's not really currently used in that region?
Yeah, so the Lepcha language is not a dialect of Tibetan. It's classed as its own language. It is still being spoken. So where Lepcha people live, so this is Kalimpong, Darjeeling, then parts of Sikkim. So they're also sort of the original inhabitants of Sikkim and parts of Nepal. But literacy in the language is very rapidly declining. There will be many people who speak Lepcha, but who will not be able to read Lepcha because the dominant language is Nepali for these regions. And it is a language under threat. So there are Lepcha societies in these regions that are trying to kind of preserve the language, and it is also my wish to cooperate with them and see if we can kind of, at least, I mean, all the material is actually digitally available, but to kind of make it findable to people and present it to people so that they can make use of it.
Thank you. Brilliant. Just to double check, are there any further questions from the floor? Otherwise, I would just like to once again say thank you very much, Berthe. It was a really fascinating discussion.